Welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on international news. I'm Swastika, and today we'll be taking a look at the Saudi Arabia's airstrikes in Yemen, the end of the Kellogg's workers' strike, and some updates from the Iran nuclear talks. Our first story is from Yemen, where on Monday the Saudi-led coalition conducted airstrikes on the airport in Sanaa. The capital of Yemen is under the control of the Houthis, who said on Tuesday that the airport could not be opened soon due to the damage. The shutting of the airport for the last 4 days has led to rising concerns about the supply of crucial humanitarian aid such as food and medicine to the war-ravaged country. Human rights groups have called for the airport to be kept out of the conflict since it is vital for the continuing supplies. Now let's connect to Abdul on a Zoom call who will tell us more about this developing story. Thank you for joining us, Abdul, on our show today. Abdul, if you could give us some context of the airstrikes that have taken place in Yemen and also the kind of humanitarian crisis that has now developed on ground.
Well, on Sunday, there was a kind of prior notice given by the Saudi Arabian coalition, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia, that there will be an airstrike because the airport, as per their news sources, is used for quote unquote launching strikes inside Saudi Arabia. And therefore, they called it a legitimate target, and they basically targeted the only source of you can say communication from outside world, which is still active in Saudi Arabia, so in Yemen right now. So they bombed it, and because of that bombing, the airport has become operational. And because of that, all international aid agencies are saying that this basically furthers and complicates the whole entire humanitarian situation in Yemen. This is primarily because in the war, which is going on for the last 6 years, what has happened that Saudi Arabia has imposed a complete blockade of Yemen. So there is air, sea, and land blockades, which basically prevents all kind of communication from outside world. And Yemen is mostly aid dependent or import based economy. Therefore, the food, medicine, and all these essential supplies which are necessary for the people are getting blocked because of all these things. An airport being the only now exceptional, Saudi Arabian coalition had allowed on occasions to kind of the aid to flow in on the pressures created by United Nations and other agencies. So even this has become inoperational for last 4 days, and we don't know how long it will prolong. That basically complicates the matter on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Also, Abdul, if you could tell us a little bit more about, war-ravaged Yemen, and which has seen so much conflict for over the last 6 years. How are things going on in Yemen right now? How are things in Yemen right now?
Well, as we all know, that in the last 6 years, what UN calls the Saudi-led war in Yemen has created the greatest humanitarian disaster of the century. The fact that millions of people in Yemen have been displaced, apart from around 400,000 people being killed, roughly, in airstrikes or war on the ground in different parts of Yemen. And another million, half of the Yemen's population, which is around 30 million, is basically starving, suffering because of the lack of medicine and all these things. As I said earlier, it is mostly an aid-dependent country, or country which has been historically dependent on imports from outside. Since because of the blockade, none of these things are reaching. So a majority of Yemenis are suffering from starvation or lack of food, malnutrition, whatever you call it, which basically has complicated the humanitarian situation. As far as the war situation is concerned, though there are occasional talks going on, sometimes in Saudi Arabian capital, sometimes in other parts of the world, none of them have yielded any results so far. There is a war ongoing for the capture of Marib, an important city in the northern Yemen, which basically is the last stronghold of the Saudi-led coalitions in the northern Yemen. once it falls, it looks like that it will fall to the Houthis again. The Saudis will lose the war by and large completely. It will be a complete loss, and therefore they don't want it to happen. And that's why they're basically bombing the regions which are directly under Houthi control, including capital Sana'a. And these bombings have increased on the basis that they are claiming that the Houthi is basically, as we all know, the Saudi Arabians' claim is Houthi is pro-Iran proxy, Iranian proxy, which basically Iran is trying to intervene through Houthis in the West, in Gulf, which is Houthis have denied it. Iran has denied it, saying that this is not about Iran or anything else. It is about the liberation of Yemen from a corrupt government, which basically the Abu Mansur Hadi government, which is in exile in Riyadh, protected by Saudi Arabia. So apart from Saudi Arabia being the leader in the war against the Yemeni people, there are other regional allies of it, and United States and UK have provided crucial support for all these airstrikes, which basically they are also a part of this conflict, the larger conflict. So that is basically, at this moment, we can't say that the war is heading towards any end anytime soon.
This is definitely a story we will keep, developments in Yemen, we will keep following from our side in our team. Thank you for joining us with those details, Abdul.
In our next story, we will be talking about the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the various parties have taken a break, and fresh talks are expected to resume in a few days on this deal, which is vital for the entire security of the region. Where are we at this key process? Prashant is here to tell us more about this. Now, Prashant, if you could tell us what are the key developments in the Iran nuclear deal at this point of time?
Right, so Swastika, the last round of talks, there's a 7th round of talks concluded last week. That's December 17th, I believe, if I'm not wrong. And the next round, that's the 8th round, is believed to start somewhere this week, some early next week, etc. So it's a bit of a mixed response. We're not entirely clear what the situation is. There are positive evaluations and there are negative evaluations of the situation right now. The positive evaluations are centered around the fact that there has been some agreement on a draft on which discussions can take forward. So it's not that a draft has been agreed on or final principles have been agreed on, but there's been some agreement on a draft on which further discussions can take place. That's a positive evaluation. The negative evaluation stems from the fact, of course, that there's been a lot of unnecessary, for lack of a better word, unnecessary saber rattling, a lot of warmongering that has been taking on, especially in the West, especially in the US and Israel. People continuously, especially say even high officials, continuously sort of making the noise that there's very little time. There might be the possibility of conflict. There's nothing is off the table, etc., etc. In fact, a group of very senior retired officials recently wrote saying that the threat of war should be imposed by the US to bring Iran to the table, so to speak. So right now it's still a bit, it's a bit up in the air. Just to give our viewers some context, we do know that the Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2015. The United States withdrew in 2018 unilaterally and imposed a very heavy set of sanctions on Iran, which has crippled Iran's economy, caused a lot of harm to Iran's people during the time of the pandemic. Joe Biden, who came to power after Trump withdrew, initially said that he wanted to go back to the deal. But during his time, the sanctions have continued. They don't call it maximum pressure anymore, maybe, but the sanctions have continued. In fact, fresh sanctions have been imposed. And, Iran's patience is also sort of Iran's patience is being tested. So Iran has also taken a slightly more hardline stance. They've enriched uranium to 60%. Not to 90%, of course. The IAEA says that Iran is not enriching uranium any further, which could take it to nuclear weapon grade. Iran has also said that it does not want to, its nuclear program is entirely peaceful. It does not want to take it to the military stage. But nonetheless, the threats continue from the West. Even Europeans are saying, for instance, that, Iran's nuclear capability is a big problem. So we have a mixed situation, like I said. There is some hope. The possibility of the Iranians' main demand, of course, has been that there should be sanctions relief. So there's some hope. It's better than what was the situation early in December when the talks were going on, because it looked like things were a very bad situation. It looks better from that, definitely, but still a lot of uncertainty ahead.
So what should we expect in the next round? Because it's looking parties have not quite decided, right?
Right. So I think we need to look at the demands of each of the players. For
Okay.
instance, Iran's demand is very clear. It wants very concrete assurances about sanctions relief. Now, why does it want that? It's very simple reason, because there was a deal, the JCPOA. Trump withdrew from that deal and imposed sanctions. So Iran's question is that, suppose Biden brings America back into the deal.
Yes.
Why is it? How are we sure that 3 years later, when a new U.S. government comes to power, suppose it's a Republican government, suppose it's a more hardline Democratic government, how can we be sure that the U.S. will not withdraw once again and impose sanctions?
Yes.
So they're calling for some kind of assurances on the issue of sanctions, because that is the single thing which is really wrecking Iran's economy right now, right? So on the other hand, the US is not really prepared to make very solid commitments about it. So that's really one issue around which, a lot of these talks have kind of been stuck. Iran is happy abandoning its enrichment of uranium as long as it is ironclad assurances about sanctions, whereas the US is not in a position to give them. So that's really one major rock in which, some of these talks have hit. The other aspect, of course, is that from the United States, and especially from Israel, and we need to see these countries' positions as well, because, for instance, Israel is not a signatory to the deal, but Israel has kept up the talk of war, including the talk of attacking Iran if necessary. There's been a lot of warmongering by Israeli officials, and that is also a very problematic stance. And in the middle, you have the European countries, you have Russia and China, who are trying to negotiate some kind of a possible settlement. But I think a lot of this boils down to really this question of verifiable sanctions relief, which I think is very important as far as the Iranians are concerned, because they want very concrete guarantees. They want some kind of assurances about the future. They want a verification of the fact that the sanctions will be withdrawn before they themselves. And as far as the Iranians are concerned, this nuclear enrichment of uranium is a matter of leverage. So they realize that that's the only leverage they have to get
Yes.
consider the deal. And it's also a problem because we know that the United States is going into elections soon. The midterms are going to come up. So there's actually, maybe many experts have pointed out, there's a slightly narrow window. So if this deal has to go back on track, we may be slightly short of time, not because of Iran's nuclear enrichment, but because of the fact that US domestic compulsions might again force Biden to take a hardline stance. So Biden may not want to go into a deal and look weak in front of the domestic audience or whatever at that point of time. So we have multiple factors we need to consider, and hopefully the coming weeks of talks will prove a bit more fruitful. It's very important because I think as long as there is even the slightest threat of war in the region, it's extremely dangerous. This region, of course, producing a lot of oil. It's extremely important for the stability of the entire world. The Persian Gulf region, Iran, the Gulf countries, all of this. Any attempt at any kind of conflict which, say, blows up into a larger war could have disastrous consequences for millions of people, for the entire world's economy. As it is, the whole world is struggling with COVID-19. The last thing we read right now is some kind of a conflict which escalates into a war. So I think it's very important that all sides sort of constructively come together, abandon the talk of war, abandon the talk of conflict, and look at what is the easiest way to come to a deal as quickly as possible.
Well, then we will keep our eye on the next set of developments on this nuclear deal. Thank you for joining us. And finally, we go to the United States, where a historic strike by Kellogg's workers has ended after the latter approved a new contract with much better benefits than what they were offered initially. The strike by around 1,400 workers was one of the most significant ones in recent times and saw the company even threaten to replace the striking workers. The strike also saw widespread solidarity from sections across the US. We have with us Monica Cruz on Breakthrough News for more.
Hi, Monica. Thank you for joining us today. And we want to talk to you about the strike which was being led by Kellogg's workers, which has finally come to an end after 11 weeks, almost 3 months after the workers voted to ratify a new contract. So first, can you start by telling us about this contract? What is the final offer? And what are the sort of benefits that they are likely to receive?
So, according to the BCTGM, which is the union representing these workers, 1,400 workers were on strike, and they all won a contract with no permanent two-tier system, which was a huge point of contention in this strike, and also in a lot of other recent strikes that we've seen across the U.S. So they also have a easier path to full-time employment for workers working part-time. and all new workers. And they're also going to put a moratorium on plant closings. So no plants in the US will be shut down throughout October until October 2026. They'll be putting a pause on that. And that was also another big issue because these workers were being threatened with having their plants closed and having new plants open in Mexico as well. There is a huge increase in their pension multiplier, and they also were able to maintain cost of living adjustments to their pay scales. So, and that was another big issue that was, going to be taken away in the past contract offers. And essentially, there were really no concessions, no takeaways in this new contract. So it's a huge win for these 1,400 workers.
Right, and this was one of the biggest strikes in recent times in the US. So, what kind of impact will this have on labor organizing and mobilizing in the country, and what kind of solidarity these workers receive within the country, with outside the country? Can you tell us about that?
For sure. So I'll speak on the solidarity piece first. It was really incredible to see so many politicians speak out in support with the workers. You had progressive senator, two-time presidential candidate Bernie Sanders holding a rally at the Kellogg's headquarters in Battle Creek, Michigan last Friday, which drew out a large crowd, hundreds of people coming out in solidarity with these workers. You also had President Biden issuing a statement condemning Kellogg's for threatening to permanently replace the workers, calling that move an attack on the union and on workers' livelihoods. And as well, we saw a lot of really interesting tactics of solidarity being employed online in terms of people figuring out all these hacks to like easily crash the application systems for all the different job application portals for the 4 plants that were hiring strike breakers. So there was this whole Reddit thread of all of these young people on TikTok creating all of these, I'm no techie, but creating basically all these codes where you could easily fill out an application. It would take like a minute to just quickly buzz through the application, have it auto-filled, and they were able to crash the system for one of the application portals on one point, actually, to really just stick it to management and say that, we're not going to participate in this scabbing, in this strike breaking. So it also got a lot of media attention. The strike was in the headlines in major publications across the country. So it was really incredible to see that amount of solidarity. People also taking lead on workers' calls for a strike. So folks were striking Kellogg's these past few weeks, and yeah, it was just definitely a really powerful show of solidarity from workers across the country in a variety of tactics. In terms of what this means for the labor movement overall, I mean, this comes after a year of an upheaval in labor organizing and in strikes across the US. So I think this was a really beautiful note to end on. And seeing these workers vote down a contract offer just earlier this month, and now be able to really come to the table and receive something and end their strike on a contract with no concessions. So it just really goes to show that when workers hold strong on the picket lines, stay unified, and that when workers across the country of all strata of our class come together to stand in solidarity with striking workers, that gives them more leverage at the bargaining table. So, and then also, a funny thing that we were seeing a lot, people posting pictures on social media of the people who, I guess weren't aware of the strike, weren't participating in the boycott, were posting all these pictures of just like the terrible mistakes that they were seeing in their Kellogg's products, like their pancakes brand, like having like burn marks on them, like weird things in the cereal, like pieces of plastic in their cereal, things coming out all kind of crazy and funky. and people were putting it on social media, like at, Kellogg, just like, what is this? And I think that also, really stuck it to the company in terms of like, these striking workers are the only ones who know how to protect the integrity of your brands and who know how to carry out their jobs properly. There were incidents of fires and accidents, injuries, in these plants that had hired the strike breakers. So it really was just from top to bottom such a powerful display of workers' solidarity and of the power that workers have to change their conditions and fight for something better. So overall, just really summed up this entire year. I think was a perfect example of what this year in U.S. labor has shown us.
Indeed. Very inspiring struggle. So thank you for talking to us today.
That's all that we have on this show, Daily Debrief, for today. Do come back tomorrow and do follow us on People's Dispatch. Thank you.